Back in ancient Sumeria, there were a lot of interesting things going on circa 2400 BC. While the Egyptians were doing their thing along the Nile, the Sumerians were also developing some of the larger territories of the time, and their kings were party to some of the earliest known written records of social reforms. For those of you who forgot, or are just tuning in, I'm Sarah, author, gamer, and generally a nerd, and while I'm working on my novels, I've been reading my way forward through time. So if you care to stick around on this little adventure of mine, grab a hard hat and join me down in the depths. This is The Memory Hole. So you're getting a whole lot of bang for your buck today as we're looking at not one, not two, not even three, but 4 historical artifacts, the first of which is the Eanatum Boulder. And that seems that it should have a joke in there somewhere about how history rocks, or some such. Anyway, focusing, Eanatum was a king sometime during the latter half of the 25th century BC. He ruled the city of Lagash, which was located in the southeastern end of Mesopotamia. Now, if you're trying to find it on a map today, the area is actually in modern-day southeast Iraq, right between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. The Boulder and the Vulture Stele, which seem to have been carved around the same time, record Eanatum's exploits as he conquered the neighboring city-states, pacified them, and made them his vassals. Naturally, he used divine providence to justify his exploits, and that's why one of the first things written on the boulder is his connections with the various Sumerian gods. Once again, you'll need to break out your web browser because there are a lot of them. You'll probably need it to figure out the list of cities he conquered too, but I can at least get you started. So, in order of appearance, there's Ningirsu, who was the god of war, farming, and the south wind, as well as Enlil, the god of air and keeper of the tablet of destiny, and there's also Nanshi. Now, I felt the need to comment on this, but for a lot of my information, I used the Ancient History Encyclopedia, and for the most part, it's pretty useful and cites its sources. But for this entry, you'll notice that it tells you she's the goddess of accounting, divination, and social justice. Now, from what it sounds like, she was described in the older texts as looking after the widows and orphans and the debt slaves and other people who were having a hard time in Sumerian society. My issues with using social justice to describe this are twofold. One, the term did not exist before 1840, so the Sumerians definitely would not have had a concept anywhere close to what we think of, and two, it is a politically charged term that does not help this conversation. Therefore, I think it's probably better to describe her as a divine custodian of the socially disadvantaged, much the way Hermes in the Greek pantheon watched over travelers. I think it is important that we are specific when it comes to what we are talking about, and that we should avoid getting bogged down in fraught issues where we don't have to. Moving on, and oh hey, Nintude's back, this time as Ninhursag, mother of gods and men, along with Inanna, who would later be known as Ishtar, goddess of love, procreation, fertility, and also war. Then we have Enki. He's the god of lots of stuff, including wisdom, fresh water, intelligence, mischief, crafts, magic, exorcisms, healing, creation, fertility, and art. And then we have Hendursag, who is the god of law. After Enki, you'd think he'd have a few more responsibilities, but no, just law. I couldn't figure out exactly what Lugalurub was responsible for, but apparently he at least presided over one of 3 festivals where you honored your ancestors, but that was as much as I could find in a few web searches. As I said before, it's also handy to know your Sumerian geography. So in order of appearance, we have Lagash, which is located in modern-day southeast Iraq. Girsu, patron city of the god Ningirsu, and sitting a bit west of Lagash. Also Nigin, a small settlement between the two. Also between these two cities, you'll hear mentioned on this boulder and in the Vulture Stele mention of this thing called the Guedana, which was a fertile plain that allowed the various city-states to farm. So gaining control of that was a pretty big deal in the area. Further afield, the boulder also mentions the country of Elam, which is in modern-day Iran, and Umma, which is a city west of Girsu. The boulder also mentions and Uruk, which are southwest of all these other places and sit along the Euphrates. Now, interestingly enough on that count, I also learned that Uruk may actually be the root word that became the modern-day name for Iraq, through words in Middle Persian and also Aramaic. There are a few other cities mentioned for which we do not know the location, but the Boulder says they were destroyed, so that's probably why. Even further afield, the Boulder talks about Akshak, a city around the area where Baghdad stands today, and Eanatum's conflict with its king, which he defeated. The Boulder also mentions the city-state of Kesh, or Kish in this reading, which also sits near modern Baghdad. Both of these sit near a spot where the Tigris and the Euphrates kind of bend closer together, so I expect that's strategically advantageous in some way. Later, they mentioned Subartu, which is closer to modern-day Saudi Arabia, and Mari, which is closer to modern-day Syria. Other things that might be helpful to know in reading this text are that Tidnu is a name given in the language of the Amorites, which are also associated with areas near modern-day Syria. The Boulder also mentions a gur measure, which is about 300 liters, and bitumen, which is petroleum residue. That's a lot to learn from a giant rock that was only supposed to talk about some king's military exploits. Next on our agenda, we have the Vulture Stele. Now, one nice thing about having gone over the text on the Boulder first is that now we have all this shiny new background for understanding what's going on in the Stele, so we don't have to go over all those gods and cities again. Because of this, we can focus on what's actually being said in the text, which justifies why Eanatum went to war with the kings of the various city-states in discussion, along with how the gods bestowed their blessings upon him in rather graphic detail. So yeah, if you want to know the whole story about how Eanatum was literally birthed into this world by the gods and exactly how they implanted the male bodily fluids containing his essence in his mother's womb, and how he was nursed by Inanna herself from her, tracts of land, yeah, they went a bit PG-13 on this one. Although by how much, we may have to just speculate, because there is an awful lot of the text all over the Stele that's just gone. So after giving us all the tabloid details of how the gods made Eanatum awesome, the Stele goes back into telling the many grievances the city of Umma visited against the city of Lagash and the field of Guedana, which justified Eanatum going to kick their asses. According to the Stele, once those asses were suitably kicked, and the old king of Umma was replaced with a new one he could deal with, the rest of the front of the Stele continues with the new king of Umma promising Eanatum his city won't be a bad boy again by swearing an oath by 6 different gods, and the oaths are repeated in full for each god. On the other side, after once again touting his god-given credentials, the Stele talks about a few other lands that Eanatum defeated, including Elam and Subartu. There's not nearly as much there, and along the edge it's just Eanatum, the subjugator of many foreign lands of Ningirsu. Now, before we continue on from Eanatum, I would like to point out a fascinating essay I found at the website Sumerian Shakespeare, discussing the concept of the Shepherd King. As a matter of fact, I highly recommend the website as a whole. If you want to learn about Sumerian history, go there. You'll learn a lot. As it points out, one of the key differences, it seems, in the philosophies between Sumer and the other countries that existed in this period was the idea of the king as a divine civil servant, rather than a god ruler or god-ordained ruler to be served. Yeah, as the essay admits, kings in Sumer probably had a large amount of variance in how strongly they held to this creed, but the fact that it had root in their beliefs is not insignificant. And that segues us into the last 2 items on our list for this video, the Enmetena tablet and the Code of Urukagina. Enmetena was a nephew of Eanatum's who made a few changes in the way his territory was run, including remissions of loans for the indebted and easing of obligations to the state in favor of widows and orphans. It's a relatively short tablet, but between this and the Code of Urukagina, we have the first inklings of the concept of liberty. Urukagina was another king of Lagash a little bit after the time of Enmetena, circa 2350 BC, and his claim to fame is being the orchestrator of some more of the earliest known social reforms guaranteeing the rights of property owners and revamping the civil administration of Lagash, as well as banning the seizing of property and goods by the government and religious authorities for payment and tithes. He also fired most of the tax collectors. Just think how wonderful it would be if we could do that to the IRS. In all seriousness, his focus on social reforms did prove to be his undoing in the end, as according to other sources, he so alienated the social elites, who were also usually the military elites, that they refused to fight for him when the king of Umma came to get his revenge for all of Eanatum's ass-kicking. Don't quote me on this, as I can't speak to what Sumerians were thinking at the time, but it seems rather unlikely to me that someone wasn't including Eanatum's campaigns in the injustices they claimed Lagash visited on Umma to justify going to war with them. That's just how the game is played. But if he had been able to make them happen and keep a hold on his territory, it would have been awesome. Anyway, the record of his reforms are enshrined in 2 cones that were put in the foundations of temples that were built at the time. The first of which details the abuses he intended to set right, and the second of which details the reforms he put in place to rectify them. So after the first bits of text talking about the new temples he built, in which we are introduced to Bao, Sumerian goddess of dogs and healing, interesting story there, the first cone discusses how the head boat builders and shepherds and fishermen, all government officials of the time, had the right to seize the property of others, and how the priests were levying excessive grain taxes. Bribes and corruption were also a problem, and government officials would make use of animals owned by the kingdom to tend their personal lands and use those bribes to make other officials look the other way. Fees for burial were ridiculous, the religious elites could take down trees from someone's property if they wanted, and women and children couldn't inherit property at all. That sounds kinda awful. Fortunately, on the second cone, Urukagina lists off all the awesome things he did to remedy these issues, and he did a lot of it by firing everyone, which admittedly probably explains why the aristocracy was kinda ticked off. He placed his royal lands under the jurisdiction of the temples, reduced the cost of burial, provided more charity, outlawed aristocrats from forcing lower-class individuals to sell to them, including the practice of allowing said aristocrats to beat up anyone who said no, and protecting the widows and orphans from the aristocracy. Granted, I wouldn't exactly call all of his reforms perfect. Calling an amnesty for all criminals, including thieves and murderers, maybe not the best choice. Because now you got murderers running around in your streets. And then he had price controls, which, as the Great American Depression in the 1930s teaches us, were probably not so good either. But hey, this was around 2350 BC. He didn't know what we know now, and we can't expect him to get everything right on the first try. So credit where credit is due. Well, that's about all I got for you today. For myself, I had a lot of fun on these, and I hope you check them out for yourself. I look forward to the next video where we go back to Egypt to look at the maxims of Ptah-hotep. If you had as much fun as I did, share, like, subscribe, stay curious, and keep digging. See you soon!